Thank you, Kate. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Manure Matters. This, as you know, is a webinar hosted by BFREPA on the subject of manure matters. And looking at the size of the audience, it really does. There's nearly 300 people signed up for this evening's event. Just to put that into perspective, roll back the clock a couple of years and cost of production was on everybody's mind, obviously a huge priority. And when a similar webinar was arranged, I think the participation was something in the region of 100 to 120. So, you know, not far short of 3 times that signed up for today. It shows just how important today's topic is, and potentially collectively an acknowledgement that you know, we can and we must do more to make sure that our trade has, at the very worst, a neutral impact on the environment and on the world around us. So my name's Tom Willings. I'm your chairman for this evening. I'm not going to do too much talking today. I'm here simply to do the housekeeping and to try to keep things on time. Ably assisted, and I'm going to start with the usual thank you, ably assisted by Kate Dickinson, who's in the background and is running the show. So Kate's going to make sure that the speakers work and everything runs as it should. So Kate, a big thank you to you. Also, big thank you to Keith Wild, as ever, in the background, pulling the strings, making these things happen. They don't happen by accident. They take an awful lot of work to organise, to get speakers' diaries lined up and sponsorship in place. And of course, that leads me to my next thank you, which is to our sponsor for this evening, which is NewQuip. And we're incredibly lucky. We've got some fantastic firms that support our industry as a whole, but the consistency with which NewQuip put their hand in their pocket to make sure that events like these can take place is unparalleled. So a big thank you to NewQuip. A thank you also to our speakers, who of course are giving up their family and free time to talk to us, just as you are in participating in this event. You might have heard at the beginning, but I should tell you that this is being recorded. And the intention is to make the recording available to everybody in the coming days. So if you haven't caught it live, then it can be watched on catch up, as it were. Last couple of bits of housekeeping. The chat function is disabled, so please don't start keyboard warrioring into the chat function. But you can use the Q&A. We, of course, asked for questions in advance of the webinar, and it will be no surprise, with so many people having signed up, that we've received an awful lot of questions. So when we get to the end of the talks, that is where we will start with those advanced submissions. It's highly likely we won't get to every single question, but I want to pass on the commitment from the speakers to the audience that whatever we do not get to here and now, the commitment from everybody participating in this webinar, it is that we will go away where consultation is needed with colleagues, get that, and then come back with full answers that we can share to everybody. But if you did submit a question, and many did, if you did submit a question in advance, thank you, because it really helps direct the content of these talks. Before we get on to the topic itself, we're going to start with a bit of a poll. So this is the first test of the technology. Kate, I don't know if you can hear me. I hope you can hear me, but I wonder if you could press the go button on the poll question. I'm going to give that about 30 seconds. There we go. Fantastic. So we want to know where you're based. We've only got 2 questions. We'll give you 10 or 15 seconds to answer, but if you can just click one of the multiple choice options. We've got other, because we undoubtedly will have an international audience for tonight's content. So if I could play the countdown music, I would. Just wait for bated breath to find the answer as to where most people are dialing in from today. We've got the results of that, Kate. There we go. So 75% from England and Wales. Just a quick reminder that Nicola Salter and Sharon Chisholm are representing NRW and the Environment Agency respectively. So we've got Wales and England only represented in the talks. So for our Scottish and our Northern Irish viewers or listeners, I suppose apologies. We'll put some links as to where you can get information as well. But the majority of today's content, and certainly Nick and Sharon's content, is directed at England and Wales. The second question, last question coming up. This just again helps us talk to the audience with greater relevance. Kate, over to you. Tell you what, this is going well. Is your farm above or below the IPPC threshold of 40,000 birds? Hopefully one that doesn't take too long to answer. And the results, perhaps. There we go, nearly 80% below the IPPC threshold. Fantastic. So without further ado, the speakers are going to keep their cameras off during the presentations. I'm going to hand over to Nicola Salter and Sharon Chisholm. As I say, Nicola is, hold on, sorry, let me get the correct title, the lead specialist advisor at NRW, and Sharon Chisholm, senior environmental officer at Environment Agency, and they're going to do a joint presentation. The title for all presentations is along exactly the same theme as to why manure matters, but without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sharon and Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'll just share my screen. Did you say cameras on or cameras off? I thought we were putting cameras on when we were presenting.
Cameras on for presenters, please.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Sorry.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Can you see me and can you see the screen?
We can.
Excellent. Sharon, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Excellent. Right, okay. You're going to kick off or shall I?
Yeah, you kick off.
Okay, so we were asked to talk. So my name's Nick Salter and I'm the lead specialist advisor for agricultural regulatory approaches in Wales, Natural Resources Wales. And Sharon?
I'm a senior environmental officer for agriculture. I've worked for the Environment Agency in agriculture for about 25 years. And I'm just currently working a little bit more closely at the moment with the poultry sector in the West Midlands area of England. Next slide, please, Nick. So the first thing we wanted to just cover, so our presentation will be covering the use, the storage and the export of manures. And then at the end, if we've got time, we'd like to cover any government. There's a bit of feedback on somebody's microphone. So yes, we'll cover the use, storage and export of manures, and if there's time at the end, we'd like to cover any government and supportive incentives that can help with manure management. So the first thing we wanted to do this evening was just to put up a slide showing the value of manure, just to kind of get our attention, because this is all about obviously making the most of your manure and understanding its value. So this slide is demonstrating firstly the monetary value. So if we look at the top box, the fertilizer prices there in the blue column are as of July this year. And then if we link that then to the next table and go down to layer manure, on the final box along that row, you'll see that the value of layer manure at a rate of application rate of 5 tonnes per hectare is worth about £102 per hectare if we make the most of that manure. So obviously it's got a significant monetary value. The table, the graph, sorry, on the left hand side is just showing the drop. I'm sorry, it's quite small, but it was just to demonstrate, obviously there has been a drop in fertilizer prices since 2022, but it was just showing the significance of those high prices in 2022 So if we think about the value now is £102 per hectare, think about, obviously what significantly higher value it was in 2022 when we had those enormous price hike rises. So that's the monetary value side of things, just to quickly highlight. And then we also need to consider and acknowledge the nutrient content, so the nutrient value of the manures. So if we just work along that column and look at, for example, the total nitrogen in an application rate of 5 tonnes per hectare, it's giving us 80 kilos per hectare of total nitrogen, of which 40 kilos would be available to the next growing crop. So that's like your equivalent bagged, your fertilizer equivalent. And then if we go along to the total phosphate content, we can see that's 65 kilograms per hectare. And if we think about, for example, an application rate onto, say, an oilseed rape crop at target index for phosphate of 2, the crop requirement would be around 50 kilos per hectare of phosphate. So we can see there the value of the manure that applied at 5 tonnes per hectare. It would give us enough phosphate for that crop to grow that season. What we'd also like to do, obviously, as we go through the presentation, is to highlight not only the value of it, also sometimes the limitations of it, because if, for instance, your phosphate index was higher, your crop requirement would be lower because your soil would already be supplying that phosphate. So that application rate would need to drop down. But we're going to cover that in a bit more detail. This was just literally to highlight the value, the monetary and nutrient value of it. So what we're going to do as we go through the presentation is we're going to go through sort of the basics, steps of nutrient management planning, so the things to consider, and how the regulations apply to each of those. So and we will go through, which is why we've done the presentation together as Environment Agency and NRW, so that as we go through each aspect of nutrient planning and integrating manure into that nutrient plan, we will highlight the relevant parts of those regulations, both in Wales and in England. Next slide, please, Nick. Over to you, Nick.
Yes, sorry, I'm still muted. I'm having trouble doing both things at the same time. It's all right. No, so in Wales, we have one set of regulations, the Water Resources Control of Agricultural Pollution Wales regulations, which were introduced in a phased approach from the 1st of April, but now are fully transposed in. So the last of the measures came in on the 1st of August this year. And they are all now part of statutory management requirement SMNR1 of cross compliance. So NRW does their day job enforcement, but we also have to report it to Welsh Government. What we've also done in Wales is we have published on our website, and the link will take you there, is how to use manures and slurries appropriately. And by appropriately, that means manures and slurries are not considered a waste if they are spread to land for agricultural benefit. And if they're not, then that would be a waste activity, an illegal waste activity. So we have published that data. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you. So in England, the main pieces of legislation that relate are the nitrate pollution prevention regulations, which we all fondly know as the NVZ regulations. They've been around for quite some time, and if you're in an NVZ, you most likely know about them and have dealt with them for quite some time. A slightly newer set of regulations which came in 2018 is a bit of a mouthful, Reduction and Prevention of Agricultural Diffuse Pollution Regulations. It does what it says, but it's more commonly known as Farming Rules for Water. So if you look up anything on the government website, gov.uk, it's normally referred to as Farming Rules for Water. And the third piece of legislation that does have a link into manure management, mostly really when we're thinking about storage, and particularly storage of wash waters and storage of any effluent that might be generated from manure storage. There is a set of regulations called, which again has been abbreviated to what is more commonly known as the SAFO regulations, which is just an acronym for the silage, slurry and agricultural fuel oil regulations. And the reference here is to the slurry part of that, which when we look at manure storage, you'll see the relevance of that. Next slide, please, Nick.
Okay, so inspections and outcomes. Our inspections, so what we've tried to do, because this is a double act, purple means just Wales, blue means just England, and sort of the dark blue, which looks sort of black, is both. So it's common. So it looks a bit multicolored on this, but we've tried to split it up so people know. So we are currently undertaking targeted risk-based by activity compliance inspections of the Control of Agricultural Pollution Regulations, which was funded by Welsh Government. Sharon?
In England, it's difficult for me to speak for all areas, but generally our approach in England is that our targeted visits for any sector of agriculture are guided by water quality issues. So if there are higher water quality issues or more serious water quality issues in a catchment, they would be targeted for visits. Visits would be by whatever sector we consider that could be causing more harm. There is a project, which is a project I'm working on at the moment in the River Wye catchment in the West Midlands, which I'm sure some of you are probably in, or if you're not in, I'm sure you've heard of it probably in the media and things. So in that project, it has come about because of the water quality issues in the Wye and the proliferation of poultry units, and the concern that the poultry units may be contributing to the water quality factors. And I'd just like to stress that it is that concern, and the point in the project is an unbiased look to ground truth, what's actually going on in the catchment. So that's the way our inspection processes work. It's very much intelligence-led and targeted to whatever we think the priorities are.
Okay, and then for permitted units, those of you who tick the box for that you're permitted units, you would have a routine inspection that's driven by the statutory inspection programme, and that will depend on whether you're part of the quality assurance scheme, which operates in England and Wales. I'm sorry, I don't know whether it operates in Northern Ireland, and then you'll get a lower frequency of inspections from our colleagues. So we want to really stress that enforcement doesn't mean prosecution. So both of us, both organisations, take a proportionate and fair approach to our regulation. So we've got policies, we've got published policies and sanctions, slightly different powers in each of those, but it is any action, enforcement action we take will be in line with those policies, will comply with the regulator's code, and it will hopefully be fair and proportionate depending on the severity of the offence and actually whether it's a repeat breach and how much impact that is having on the local environment. And as I said before on the previous slide, we've got the double whammy in Wales currently, where we're still doing cross compliance and we're reporting it to the Royal Inspectorate. So if you have been inspected by us in Wales or my colleagues in Wales and there was something wrong, you didn't comply with the Control of Agricultural Pollution regs, we would be taking enforcement action with our own hat on, what I call our day job hat, but we also report it to Rural Payments Wales or Rural Inspectorate Wales, who may withhold your basic payment or your rural payment schemes. So what's important to do with nutrients? So we're going to go through the sort of use of nutrients. It's important to make a plan. So it's what you are going to put on for what that crop needs, not actually just going out with your muck spreader and just spreading it willy-nilly, or your tanker because your slurry store is overflowing. Where you're going to put that crop, but that nutrient, that specific nutrient, as Sharon was talking about, when you're going to do it, because that will depend on the uptake of those nutrients and how. So whether you're spreading it in the picture as it is at the moment, or whether you're placing it, etc. So it is really important to think about this. And so there are within our regulations that we've talked about, there are requirements to do that, and this is where we differ a bit with what's going on. So in Wales now, you have to have a written plan for any nitrogen applications before you go out spreading. And that is manures and it is manufactured fertilizers. You need to record all those applications and retain it for at least 5 years. And there are limits that you need to comply with for that nitrogen that you are applying. So there's a field limit, which is 250 kilograms of total organic nitrogen. There is a farm limit, which is linked to your livestock manures. And there is a maximum N limit, which is the combination of your organic manures and your manufactured fertilizer, with limits stated in the regulations. And then there are spreading restrictions. So we've got the buffer zones that have come in, that were brought in from the Control of Agricultural Pollution Practice. And then we have now closed periods for spreading high readily available nitrogen containing organic manures. And in England, Sharon?
So in England, I'll skip to the second point first. Sorry to jump around on the slides, but this is probably a common theme as we go through the regulations, is I'll just refer you to what Nick just said, because the NVZ regulations in England mostly mirror the Control of Agricultural Pollution regulations in Wales. So all those things which Nick's just gone through are applicable in an NVZ area. So if you're in a nitrate vulnerable zone area, they will apply to you. Farming rules for water, NVZ tends to be a bit more prescriptive, whereas the farming rules for water is a bit more, it kind of tells you what the outcome is, and then sort of lets you decide how best your farming practices fit to achieving those outcomes, if that makes sense. But one of the regulations, what one of the regulations say is that each application of manure and fertilizer must be planned so that it does not exceed the needs of the soil and the crop, and that's the critical thing, and that's why we're going through this process with you tonight, looking at all the different aspects of nutrient planning, because it has to be an integrated approach. So it's looking at the needs of the soil and the crop on that land, and then mustn't be applied in a way that would give rise to significant risk of diffuse pollution. So one thing I forgot to say at the beginning is farming rules for water applies to all farms within England, whereas NVZ is just in an NVZ area. Farming rules for water applies to all farms in England, and it kind of, in a way, in terms of nutrient planning, it goes that step further than the NVZ regulations, because it includes all your major nutrients, not just nitrogen. So it's looking at phosphate, potassium and magnesium as well. Thanks.
Okay. And before Sharon starts on this, it may be worth noting that there are no MVZs in Wales. They are frequently referred to as the MVZ regulations in Wales, but MVZs do not legally exist in Wales. The MVZ legislation was revoked fully on the 1st of April 2021.
So the first thing to do in your nutrient planning, so step one, is to test your soil. In the nutrient planning, like I said, it needs to be an informed process. So we need to know what we're starting off with, so that we know what nutrients to apply based on what our crop needs. So a basic soil test will test for pH, phosphate, potassium and magnesium. You can get a more expensive test that tests for nitrogen, but that's a bit more complicated because nitrogen is so readily movable that the sample has to be refrigerated, and hence why the test is also more expensive. So you'll tend to see with your standard soil test, those parameters there that are up on the first bullet point of the screen. It's relatively inexpensive, and generally what people have found is that the cost savings from the information that it gives them far outweighs the cost in taking a sample. So that's what a basic test will test for. There is a method of calculating the amount of nitrogen in your soil, what's referred to as the soil nitrogen supply, and that is a book method, kind of a lookup method based on what your previous crop was, your rainfall in your area and your soil type, and so that will give you an idea of the residual nitrogen in your soil. And the basic soil test will also test for pH, and that is critical because in terms of nutrient management, because the pH affects the availability of most major and micronutrients. So it really is critical to get your pH right. It's almost like the starting point before you start to look at the nutrients. So the general advice is to sample fields at least every 3 to 5 years. But depending on what you're growing, you might want to sample more regularly, particularly in front of sensitive crops, for instance, like potatoes, and maybe where fertilizers and manures, particularly manures, have been used quite heavily in previous years. So you may want to sample more frequently than 3 years. And the last bullet point, really important, that a representative sample is taken, because this is what you're basing your decisions on. Therefore, in terms of financial links, it's really critical that you get a representative sample to send away for analysis. Next slide, please, Nick. So is this in regulation? Yes, it is in England. So the farming rules for water, as I said before, they require you to plan your nutrients, and there is also a requirement in the regulations that soil testing is done. And the requirement is that it's done at least once in every 5 years. Those regulations came in 2018, so we're now in 2024. So any field that's receiving manures and fertilizers or is cultivated at all will require a soil sample to have been taken by now. Sorry, something else I was going to say. If you're not applying any manures and fertilizers and you're not cultivating at all, so if you had permanent pasture that's just grazed only, you don't do anything with it, you don't add anything to it, you don't cultivate it at all, then you don't need to sample your soil, and for the common sense reason, that fact that you don't need to know what's in it in order to decide what to put on it. So no requirement there if you absolutely don't cultivate it and touch it and do anything with it, just graze it. On to Wales, Nick.
So we have no soil testing requirement under the control of agriculture pollution regs, other than calculating, as Sharon said, there's your soil nitrogen supply, but it is really good practice to be able to do that. The other thing we should say is the control of agriculture pollution regs they have a statutory 4-year review built into them. So while there's nitrogen is in there now, and soil nitrogen supply, we're in a review year. Welsh Government will be going out for public consultation on this, so things may change, but we're talking to you as the regs stand now. This is me as well. So you get your recommendation of what you work out your soil nitrogen supply based on your previous crop and your soil type and your rainfall, and then it gives you a RB209 will give you a recommendation, but it will also tell you that you may not need to apply it at certain times for certain soil indices, and then you've got to think about the time of year that you're actually putting it on. So some crops you may be able to justify putting a small dressing on in the autumn, but others you can't. So you really do need to sort of think about what you're doing. And there are tools out there, and hopefully if we get time, I might be able to talk a bit more about that, of what's being developed. So going on to the regulations, I'll do Wales first. So we've talked about the N applications, writing a plan before spreading, all applications, 5 years. Have we gone backwards? Yes, we have, because that's you.
Oh, sorry. Need to go back.
Backwards. It's not doing it. That's you.
Yeah, I think you're the previous one, Nick, which was just talking about crop need regulation. That's the one. Yep.
Sorry, I'm trying to answer questions and do this, which is not a good idea. I'll stop trying to multitask. Same as we said before, the amount and timing and the regulatory requirements are set quite prescriptively in the control of agriculture pollution regs. But as Sharon said, farming rules for water gives you the more general sort of overview.
Yeah, so Envy's eggs mirrors exactly as Nick said, with control of agricultural pollution regs, farming rules for water, just that reminder of that catch-all which says each application must be planned so it meets the needs of the soil and the crop. So that's why it's important to go through that step in your nutrient planning to understand what your crop needs, not only what your crop needs in terms of amount, but as Nick highlighted, the timing as well. So that crop need, when we're assessing from a regulatory point of view, that crop need is assessed on timing as well. For instance, oilseed rape, as Nick put up, you know, that crop has a requirement for nitrogen, and it does have a small amount, it does have a small requirement for nitrogen in the autumn, whereas, for example, winter cereals don't have that autumn requirement because there is enough in the soil, generally enough in the soil for that first bit of growth into the winter. So we're also assessing that against that. So it's not just amount, it's also timing. Next slide, please, Nick. So the next step, step 3 in the nutrient planning, is to understand what's in the manure. So if you're going to use manures, you must go through this step and work out what nutrients are in the manures. So you can use standard figures to help you work this out. And this is what's up on the slide at the moment. This comes from RB 209, which is AHDB's fertiliser manual. Or you can take a representative sample of the manure and send it away for analysis. It is best practice. We do like to push that sampling of manure because the more accurate you can get with this step, the more efficient you could be with nutrient use. So we do encourage people to take a representative sample. Particularly, these figures are recognised to be a little bit out of date and off, particularly with regard to things like phosphate, and particularly things like phosphate in broiler diets have dropped, and that's affected the phosphate output in the manure. So we know that these are slightly differ from what we're seeing in reality out on farm. Again, the sample must be taken, it must be a representative sample taken. So we need to make sure that's done really carefully by taking several sub-samples, either from within the housing or the manure heap, mixing it well and bulking these up before they're sent for analysis. So a bit of extra time to spent on this process is really well worth it to make sure you get the best information possible. So the results can then help you decide how much to apply to the crop, to get the nutrients you need. So you've gone through that decision making of what does the crop need. You can then, from this information, decide how much nutrients your crop needs, or if there are limitations on what your crop needs, as in, would you be over applying? Because we need to remember that we don't want to over apply, because upsetting the balance of nutrients in the soil can also affect yield and quality, because it can cause an imbalance. So that, along with the fact that we don't want excess nutrients in the soil, which is why a lot of the regulations set standards and limits to things, because if there is excess manures, nutrients, fertilizers going into the soil, there is a risk of losses to the environment if that crop is not taking those nutrients up. So it's really critical that we get this process as precise as possible. If, for example, so we looked at that slide at the beginning that looked at a crop produce that was for a 40% dry matter manure at 5 tonnes per hectare. And if you remember, it was going to provide 65 kilograms per hectare of phosphate. If, for example, so say for that oilseed rape crop, that would have been okay. But if we had an 80% dry matter manure, you can see that the higher the dry matter, the more concentrated the nutrients in it are. So this bottom table, just underneath the red circle, if, for example, we were using an 80% dry matter manure at 5 tonnes per hectare, that would be applying more phosphate than that crop, oilseed rape crop, would have needed. And so the application rate would need to be lowered. So this is why it's important to get that analysis and understand what's in it from all the nutrients point of view. The You'll see from the table that gives you total phosphate, available phosphate, and total phosphate and available phosphate, and also the similar for potash, so you can calculate what's likely to be available to your next growing crop. With nitrogen in the top table, you can see that again the nutrient content increases quite significantly as the dry matter content goes up. But the availability will very much depend, because as I mentioned before, nitrogen is so movable, particularly when it gets into the soil and biological activity takes over. The time of year and the method of application will greatly affect how much of that total nitrogen you will get for your next growing crop, so i.e. your bagged fertilizer equivalent. And poultry manure is very valuable in that respect, because it has a lot of readily available nitrogen. If you put the next slide, please, Nick. So this slide is just demonstrating that readily available nitrogen. So what we term readily available nitrogen is what's potentially available to the crop. And then we also use the term crop available nitrogen, which is what's available at the time of application. What we want to do is make sure that we use as much of that readily available nitrogen, and that becomes crop available nitrogen. So timing is really critical, as is method of application, as I spoke about before. So what these pie charts demonstrate is the proportion of what we call readily available nitrogen in the manures. And you can see from the top two on the left hand side that cattle slurry and poultry manure have, so the light blue bit and the light blue and orange is the readily available nitrogen. The rest of it is total nitrogen, so that will go into the soil, but it generally wouldn't be available to the crop. It will break down and mineralize over time, so it will supply to a certain extent future crops. And that's what you would be also taking into consideration when you're thinking about your soil nitrogen supply. So those two manures, you can see on the poultry manure, there are different forms of available nitrogen. So you've got your ammonium nitrogen and your uric acid nitrogen. Both of them are potentially very readily available. And in quite a high proportion, you can see they're probably about 40% of the total nitrogen in your manure. And just out of interest there, you can look down and see cattle farmyard manure doesn't have a high proportion of readily available nitrogen, which is why it's much less risky to apply that nitrogen in the autumn, because there's much less risk of losing it. And we need to remember that we're not only talking about losses in terms of potential damage to the environment and the water environment, but those losses equal monetary losses to the farm business as well. So, and then if you just swing across to the top right, again, just out of interest, if you look at whole digestate, you can see how much of that is readily available nitrogen. So that's why it's sometimes fondly referred to as rocket fuel. So, you know, it really is, there's a lot of readily available, i.e. bagged fertilizer equivalent nitrogen in digestate. So if you ever do a manure for digestate swap, just bear that in mind. Next slide, please, Nick. So we talked about the limiting factors with nitrogen. So then let's just have a quick look at the other nutrients, for example, phosphate, and why it's important to understand the amounts of phosphate that the manure will supply, which is what we looked at a couple of slides ago with the different dry matter manures. So there's several things that we've considered up until this point to enable a good decision to be made. So we've looked at what's in the soil, what does the crop need in addition to what's in the soil, and what amounts of nutrient are in the manure that could supply this, but equally what may oversupply it if we apply it at the wrong time and in the wrong amounts. And so to help us focus back on this is an example of a soil test result. And if we use these soil test results in our decision making, we can see here with this example, it's an example for grassland, but just ignore that, that's not relevant for now. So it's best practice to aim for optimum soil phosphate levels in the soil. And for phosphate, crop rotations generally aim for a phosphate index of 2, or 3 if vegetables are grown in the rotation. So we can see from this example here that the top 3 fields are above the target index for phosphate. So with a lot of crops, they wouldn't require any additional phosphate. Some crops may require a small amount, but it does very much depend on what you're growing. And this is really critical because when we go back to the statement in Farming Rules for Water, or the rule within Farming Rules for Water, it says, if you remember, that we shouldn't be applying above the need of the crop and the soil. So if our soil is above target index, it's saying as the soil doesn't need any. If we've looked up our crop requirement and it says at phosphate index 3, our crop, for example, oilseed rape, doesn't require any additional phosphate at index 3, then we would need to make a decision there on what we're going to apply to feed that crop. And in this instance here, manures containing phosphate wouldn't be the right choice, because you, at the moment, you can't take the phosphate out of manures. Poultry litter does contain a fair amount of phosphate, so using phosphate frequently at high rates above that, which the crop in the rotation would remove, could likely to cause the levels in the soil to raise above that, which we would want to see. And remember, again, it can cause that imbalance in your soils for you that will affect crop growth. So an example of this is, for you, standard figures. If we grew cereals and oilseed rape in a rotation and we applied poultry litter at 60% dry matter at, for instance, 6 tonnes per hectare, that would give us about 102 kilograms per hectare over 4 years. So we would have added, 102 kilograms per hectare a year. So over a 4-year rotation, that would have added just over 400 kilos of phosphate to the soil. Those crops at a standard yield over 4 years would remove about 200 to 250 kilos. So we can see here, this is just an example that there would be an extra 150 kilos that had been added to the soil, that would start to build that soil index up and those levels up. Obviously, this is all based on standard yields and some standard figures, but it's just to set an example of how frequent manure use, particularly high phosphate manures such as poultry manure and solid digestate, for example, is another one, where if they're used heavily in a rotation and frequently, they can start to build the level up. So it's really important to keep an eye on these soil index levels. Next slide, please, Nick. So if you choose not to use your manures that you're producing from your free range units, you can export them. So whether you're exporting them to another farm for them to spread for agricultural benefit, or whether you're sending it to an AD plant or some other waste treatment facility, in Wales, you need to record all of your exports and imports if you're importing anything. You've got to report where it's gone, when it went, what they're actually going to do with it, really. So if it's going into an AD plant, etc., what volume it was that went, and your nitrogen content. If it is going onto a waste treatment facility, like an AD plant, you may need to also, depending on what they want, if they're moving it on again, you may need to do waste transfer notices, which essentially is just a bit of paper that tells you exactly what you're doing for your control of agricultural pollution regs. And in England, it's the same for MPZs.
Nicola, you've just slipped onto mute, I think, there.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay. So if you're choosing to use your manures, view, it's the same in England and Wales for these ones on this slide. You need to have a spreading risk map. You need to spread as accurately as possible. There are closed periods when you can't go out and spread, and then there are limits immediately after that closed periods. There are spreading conditions that you need to, so it's not wet or waterlogged or covered in snow. And there are no spread areas, which are your buffer strips against your surface water and your boreholes. And then you need to incorporate any applications onto bare soil and stubble as soon as possible. So that means that they, within 24 hours. So I've said about the closed periods. We're running out of time. Tom's appeared, so I'll really speed up with this. So the closed periods, the dates are up there. They are set in stone, very unpopular with farmers in Wales and elsewhere, no doubt, because it's farming by calendars. But there is a maximum rate afterwards. But there are exemptions for organic producers. Sharon?
Yeah, just similar rules. On farming rules for water, that same rule we've seen before, and also there are the no spread zones and applications not in snow, etc., so very similar.
And this is what happens when it goes wrong. So we get nutrient buildup, so we get excessive plant growth, unfortunately we get dead fish, and we get the fish eggs dying because of the nutrient imbalance. Those are all things that you can see. But also what we are also protecting is groundwater. So when the nutrients, it's particularly the nitrate, goes down, it goes down into the groundwater. A lot of the MVZs that we had in Wales historically and the ones in England are groundwater designated MVZs. So we've got to remember that even if you can't see the pollution, it may still be happening. Fertilizer use and records, we've talked about that before. I think we just skip over this and get to the storage, Sharon, yeah?
Yep.
This is what I think is the really important bit, and I think this is possibly where some people go wrong. Within the regs, there is a definition of slurry. It's the same or virtually the same across both countries, but it does include wash water and it does include the requirement to store it. You may accidentally generate slurry unintentionally. So if you've got your belt with your layer going from your layer houses out, and you've got a belt going out and it's tipping into a trailer or something, and you're emptying, you're running that belt X number of times a week, you may, if it rains, and we've been having a lot of rain, create slurry from water falling on that manure that was relatively solid before it came out. You may not have the storage that you need. This trailer may not be sealed, etc. You need to really think about that. It's very important, and I think that's one of the really difficult things that we've got on poultry farms. There are construction and capacity requirements, and then if you're putting it out to temporary field heaps, poultry manures without bedding must be covered now with an impermeable cover in MVZs in England and across all of Wales. So we've talked about the legislation, and there's restrictions for if you are putting it in temporary field heaps, you mustn't have those within 10 metres of a watercourse or 50 metres from a wellspring or borehole. The SAFO regulations were incorporated into the Control of Agriculture Pollution regulations. So our construction standards are exactly the same as the SAFO regulations in England and the same in Wales. And they have been about since 1991. They are not new legislation. This is old legislation that has just been rebadged in Wales or refreshed in Wales. And then the support available in Wales, I'll carry on. The Welsh Government have done guidance. We've got Farming Connect that does the knowledge transfer that Welsh Government put money in. We have grants and payments section on Welsh Government's website. Really good is the GLAD newsletter. You can tell I'm not a Welsh speaker. That comes out now electronically, unfortunately. And then we've got lots of local initiatives. Sharon.
One of the most critical things that recently in terms of helping with this nutrient management process is under the sustainable farming incentive is funding to assess nutrient management and produce a review report. There's also one for a soil management and review report as well, so it's good to do those in combination if you can. And then you may find as a result of doing that plan and assessment that you could go in to look at some other options as well. So there are things like nil fertilizer supplement, managing grassland to reduce nutrient levels, and variable rate application of nutrients. So these might help you kind of lead on to some other options that could give you some payment. And then we've got things under the countryside stewardship grants. One of the most sort of the best things to highlight there is the covering of manure stores, and obviously that's really important for reducing the generation of what would be classed as slurry from manure stores that are on yards that are uncovered, that could be generating an effluent that would need to be collected and contained. So the on gov.uk, the really good link actually for looking at what might be relevant for you is find funding for land or farms. That's a really good link for looking that up. So hopefully that's been helpful to you. Thank you very much. I think that's...
and then we've just got the Scotland and Northern Ireland bits. So, yeah, essentially the rules are the same wherever you are. They vary slightly. It's the importance of storing it appropriately and then using it appropriately. So, yeah, thank you.
Sharon and Nick, thank you very much indeed for taking us through that. Just a reminder to everyone, we're going to take questions, or we're going to put questions to speakers collectively as a panel at the end, if we've got time, or with as much time as we can make available. Bridie's going to go next, just while Bridie puts her slides on the screen. A reminder to all speakers, if you could look please just at the Q&A chat as it's coming through, if it's possible just to talk to those questions and cover them off as best you're able with simple, concise messages. Please do answer them on the night. If not, then we, as I said before, we'll take those away and we'll come back to the contributor or the person asking the question. Bridie, without further ado, Senior Catchment Advisor for the Wye and Usk Foundation. I think many on the call, especially in your region, will know you well. But yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Better unmute. Thank you, Tom. Okay, I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible. So there was quite a lot to digest in that presentation, all of the nuts and bolts of legislation. So I'm going to keep this fairly high level and just give you a bit of an overview of why managing manures is important for river health, and what's happening in the Wye catchment, which is where I'm based. And I do this slightly apologetically because many people, especially farmers and most definitely poultry farmers in the Wye catchment, are a bit sick of hearing about the River Wye. But given the high profile nature of the issue, I think it's better that we have some understanding of the issue and that you're aware of the efforts that are being made. And there are considerable efforts being made by many actors, organisations, charities, businesses and farmers to try and resolve some of the challenges that are affecting the Wye catchment. So by way of introduction, I don't know how to move my... There we go. I'm a catchment advisor for the Wye and Usk Foundation, which is a rivers trust, and it's a conservation charity. But my background is farming rather than conservation, and joining the two together and bridging that divide is where my main interest lies. So I grew up in a family farm in Herefordshire, and for a short time had my own free-range egg business, and it was a very small one compared to all of the ones that I see now. The article on the left was in the BFREPA magazine in 2007, I think. So I don't know whether it was Keith that interviewed me for that one. So I understand a little bit, just a tiny insight into the challenges of managing free-range chickens, the mud, the manure, the runoff. There's a lot of feet on a small area, and I know that's really difficult to deal with. So I like chickens, and I like to see them outside, and I like farmers, and I want to see them happy. And in the Wye catchment where I live, just on the border between Herefordshire and Radnorshire, the growth of the free-range egg business, the free-range egg industry, should be seen as a real success story. It's been a really valuable diversification option for many farms in the Welsh borders, and it's secured a future for many family farm businesses in the area. And this is, in my opinion, an undeniably good thing. We're a very rural area, we're very agriculturally productive, and we produce a lot of food here to feed a growing population, and that's something that we're very proud of. So I think I calculated at one time on the back of a fag packet that we produced enough eggs in this catchment, in the Y catchment, to feed 5 million people. And don't quiz me on where I got that information from or how I did that calculation, but I do remember looking up average egg intake per person per year. So I think I did actually, use some real data. So just about the river, why is there so much interest in the Wye? So it's constantly in the headlines, and its failing health is the topic of many conversations here. It's not the only river suffering from a multitude of pressures and changing climate, but it's a particularly beautiful and iconic river with habitat designations that give it special protections. Recently it's been downgraded by Natural England to unfavourable declining. People do say, anecdotally, there's quite a lot of bored journalists in Hay on Wye, which is the book town right in the middle of the catchment, and this is what they like to write about, but I can't comment on that. So what is it, what are the nutrients that, so we're talking about nutrient management and manure management, what are the things that are affecting river health? Nutrients are generally in low supply in a natural environment, and so when excessive amounts get into the water, it can stimulate algal growth and lead to blooms where algae multiply rapidly, sucking oxygen out of the water. And this is devastating for aquatic life. The nutrients of main concern are nitrogen and phosphorus. Potassium, potash, K is not much of a risk environmentally. So there's been a lot of work looking at exactly what influences algal growth, and I won't go into detail because it gets really quite complicated, but basically, in simple terms, algae need some form of nitrogen and some form of phosphorus, low flows and high temperatures, so climate change is having an impact. So that's what's needed for algae to thrive. There's been a real breakthrough recently with a study by Cardiff University in understanding exactly what it is, what nutrients are stimulating algal growth, but that's for the academics and the really clever people to think about. For now, it's just important to know that we've got to keep those nutrients out of the water, and also look at shading the rivers and keeping water flow, trying to maintain good flows of water. Those are all things that help to keep the river in good health. So when we're looking at how the nutrients are getting from farms to rivers, this is probably stuff that you know, I'm sure it is. So nitrate is the soluble form of nitrogen, and that, as Nick and Sharon were talking about, can leach. It's very mobile. It can leach through the soils. You can also get ammonium nitrogen running off from manure heaps or from insecurely stored manures. So I think everybody has an awareness of the risks from nitrogen. We all know that nitrogen fertilizers have to be spread at the right time and in the right quantities so that they don't end up in the groundwater or the surface water. And nitrogen nitrates, nitrogen applications are regulated, and that's mostly, partly because they're quite mobile, mostly because they, when they get into water, they can cause an issue for human health, and there's something called blue baby syndrome, which is cited a lot. So while nitrogen is concerned for human health, when it comes to aquatic health, phosphorus is the nutrient of particular concern and has traditionally been viewed as the limiting nutrient in freshwater systems, so that the one that we really need to keep out, otherwise we might get an algal bloom. So phosphorus gets into watercourses from manures, from manure runoff over the surface when it's applied at the wrong time, or you have a heavy down, or after you've spread muck, or it can be run off the surface in soil erosion. It's very it's attracted to soils. It has a positive charge. Phosphorus has a charge, and clay particles have a charge, and so they're very strongly associated. So when you get erosion runoff into watercourses, that also carries with it a lot of phosphorus. What's slightly less understood is how phosphorus can also leach through soils in the same way that nitrates can, and there's been recent work looking at what kind of soils are most leaky when it comes to phosphorus. There's a lot of work looking at what comes out of land drains. In Herefordshire, there's been loads of land drain testing going on in the last couple of years by farmers on high nutrient soils. But basically, in those lighter, sandy, siltier soils, if you have phosphate indices more than 2, so above target, you might be losing soil, you might be losing total phosphorus, so one form of phosphorus, into through land drains or into through base flow or into groundwater. So obviously phosphorus can also get into water from sewage treatment works, septic tanks and other human sources, but in the Y catchment, because happily we have more livestock than humans, the majority of phosphate getting into the river in this catchment comes from agricultural activity, not from human activity. And 2 different types of modelling done in the catchment have both indicated that agricultural sources are responsible for about 2/3 of the phosphorus that's making its way into the river. And so that's currently the best estimate that people in the catchment are using to develop plans to restore the river. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, but let's carry on. So because phosphorus is such a significant driver, considered such a significant driver in the deteriorating health of the river, the efforts to restore the river have been very focused on reducing the phosphorus load in the catchment. So in very simple terms, the phosphorus load is the phosphorus that we bring in feeds and fertilisers and straw and any other agricultural inputs, minus the P that we export in crops and livestock products. Animals tend to use phosphorus very inefficiently in their feeds, and so a significant proportion of the phosphorus brought in feeds is excreted in the muck and then remains here for spreading to land. So you can look at this phosphorus balance, phosphate balance at a farm scale or a catchment scale, but essentially the outcome is the same. And this ties into what Sharon was saying. If you're bringing in more than you're exporting, it will accumulate in soils and it will on your farm or in the catchment. So in the Y catchment, this has been happening for a very long time, and we have what we call a legacy P issue. I don't know whether you've heard that term. So we have some very high phosphate index soils. There's modelled to be, estimated to be about 3,000 tonnes surplus phosphorus in the catchment. That's quite a lot extra per hectare compared with the UK average 11 kilos per hectare compared with an average 4.7 kilos. There's a lot of debate around these figures. These figures are all based on standard figures from RB209 and from other sources, and estimates for the number of birds in the catchment. There's all sorts of things, kind of estimates that could do with refining, but really that's the best information that we have so far to be able to develop plans to bring the catchment back into phosphate balance. And so the solutions that people are working on, including some of the poultry businesses and many others, it's not just poultry, it's other livestock businesses and farmers in the catchment, is reducing phosphorus in poultry diets or in livestock diets generally, and also looking at how we can process and export surplus manures and nutrients out of the catchment to bring the catchment back into phosphate balance. And again, you can look at this on a sort of a farm scale or on a catchment scale. The outcome is kind of the same. So that's a bit of detail about what's going on in the catchment and what the impact is of nutrient and manure management on the river. So I think you don't need to get too bogged down in the detail. I think there are lots of people, citizen scientists, real scientists, academics, conservation groups, loads of people, farming unions, farmers themselves, looking at these issues and trying to find solutions. But really the message for the farming industry, for the free-range poultry farmers, is fairly simple, and it feels a bit patronising to kind of be repeating these to you. But it's all about managing your nutrient application so that you're not building those reserves of phosphorus in the soil that can then leach out or be lost in soil erosion. It's about applying manures in the right conditions to prevent surface runoff, trying to avoid those, spreading it before a heavy downpour. I know that's easier said than done in these very erratic weather conditions. It's about maintaining healthy and well-structured soils and always covered in vegetation wherever possible, so that you're preventing soil erosion, which can carry phosphorus into the watercourses. It's about storing manures securely and exporting surplus manures, and those last two I put in bold and given them question marks, because those are the things that are real challenges on free-range farms. The export of surplus manures from farms or from the catchment is easy with broiler manure because it's a much easier product to handle. It's harder with laying manure because it's wetter, basically. And we know that the challenge with affordability of good manure storage. There are grants available. There have been grants available in both in Wales and in England, but it's very hard to justify the expense of a manure store. But it is absolutely necessary, not only to manage the manures while it's on your farm, but also to facilitate export of surpluses. So when you get to the point where you can't put any more on your farm, you've reached your target indices, and you can't keep applying it, you need to be able to find a way of exporting it, getting rid of it to a neighbour or maybe further afield or to some sort of processing facility, so that we can avoid building those nutrients indices on your farm. So yeah, both of those things are what's needed, but quite difficult to achieve for laying farmers. So looking to the future, what we've been calling for and lobbying for, not just us, but other people in the catchment and some of the businesses that we work with, is for really good grant support that works for free-range farmers to invest in manure management infrastructure, and that's roofs over elevators and muck trailers, and it's manure stores, and it's improvements to drainage, and it's basically everything that you need to be able to really securely store and manage any nutrients that are coming from your site. There was talk a little while ago about a BFREPA grant, and myself and some of the businesses that we work with and other organisations through a poultry sector working group that we have in the catchment were lobbying BFREPA to make sure that those grants that were being offered worked for free-range farmers. Unfortunately, that talk of the BFREPA grant for the Wye catchment seems to have gone quite quiet because of the change in government, but we hope that something will become available for farmers in this area. So what we need is funding and support for farm level innovation and investment to add value to manures, and that's things like drying facilities, so that the manure coming from the farm is more valuable, easier to move, easier to store, takes up less space, all of the benefits of having a drier product. And the final thing on that list is improving understanding of nutrient management and support for farmers to manage nutrients on farm. So there's a lot of work that could be done in this area, and I know in Wales there's Farming Connect doing a really good job of trying to support farmers with access to expert advice, surgeries and all of the rest of it, so that they can do soil testing and have nutrient management plans done for them. And in England we've got the SFI funding that will pay for a farmer to have nutrient management plans, but these nutrient management is quite a scary subject for a lot of farmers that don't understand it. It's important that farmers do understand what they've got on their farm, what their crops need, that they can manage it themselves. They're not having to pay a fortune to a consultant to come and do it for them. I mean, obviously there's a place for consultants to come in and do some really good plans as well, but I think it's important that farmers understand this stuff, and it can seem quite a complicated and scary subject. So there's a real bit of work, I think, to be done on making this nutrient management straightforward as far as possible, so that farmers really understand it and can get a handle on it. So that's enough from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Bridie, thank you. Lots of common messages with the last couple of slides from Nicola and Sharon. Storage. And it's no surprise that a lot of the questions that we received in advance touch on that subject, and then the where next. We're going to hand on now to Glenn Evans, who's the Group Head of Sustainability at Noble Foods. Glenn and Charles and Patrick, I'm going to throw myself on your mercy. I'm going to ask you to be as quick as you can. And then to everybody else, I think our timings are slipping somewhat. So if dinner is going to be on the table at 8 o'clock, perhaps you could have a quiet word and say, would it be all right just to hang on for another 10 or 15 minutes? So a little warning that we are going to overrun. But Glenn, thank you.
Yeah, Tom, just make sure it's come through your end.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, I just wanted to give why manure matters an overview really from a Noble Foods point of view. So I'll crack on. So why manure matters to Noble Foods? As we heard from Sharon earlier on, manure really is a valuable resource. Not only is it good at it's full of nutrients. It's a direct replacement for artificial fertilizers. But from our point of view, poultry manure itself is really good in terms of improving organic matter in soil as well. So that can aid carbon sequestration, and really has a wider part to play for a circular economy, and really to help with our net zero ambitions as well. We see good nutrient management as a key driver to ensure manure is used in areas where it's needed. Like I mentioned previously, to replace those artificial fertilizers, but also that it's handled, stored and used in a responsible way that's environmentally sustainable. Our work associated with the Wye catchment has helped us greatly in shaping our understanding of the importance of using manures responsibly, and more importantly, its environmental effects if we don't. So you'll hear a bit of reference back to the Wye region in a few of my slides, but really it's the keystone of information that has helped us shape our ideas going forward. Collaboration is key, we feel. Retailers and other stakeholders are actively taking an interest in nutrient management, and they're wanting their supply chain to actively engage with them to take responsibility for reducing their environmental impact. In early 2023, Noble Foods signed up to the Water Roadmap. The aim of this project is to ensure and reduce the environmental impact on water resources, and we're active members of the RAP Roundtable Wye Agri-Food Partnership, amongst other forums as well. We really consider ourselves to be part of the group that are making a real positive change. We collaborate with all interested parties, and you can see the icons there in terms of the parties that we're conversing with in this area. And also we've been engaging with River Action through our CFO. So literally all parties who are interested within with this subject area. We feel really this is the best way to deal with the issues related to the Wye catchment head on, but then also more widely. And we're really we're much likely to strengthen our position collectively, and to ensure that our position is heard through government agencies as well. We've been proactively speaking with NRW and EA to build relationships, share best practice and work together to find solutions when looking at guidance, best practice guidance for free range sector. We intend to keep the conversation going and facing into some of the legacy issues that we're faced with on some of the poultry farms. So in terms of our understanding our impact, we've been working with producers to establish how the manure is used in the Uskal and Wye region through environmental questionnaires that we've been conducting. Really, this is to understand whether they utilise manures on their own land, export them within the catchment, or indeed outside of the catchment as well. What that can lead to is us understanding what our phosphate baseline is, so that going forward we can see how we could reduce that and how that could change over time. We've been assisting Lancaster University as well, who are now completing their follow-up study to the original refocus work. This is called New Harmonica, and you can find details of that on the web. The project seeks to determine the risk of exceeding permitted environmental quality standards. So what we did is provide bird numbers and some manure analysis that we had for the Wye region, so that they can build up a more accurate picture of the impact of layers in that particular region. We've also been working with the Wye Foundation in the catchment to understand how we can prevent nutrient losses on our farms. So that could be from, as Bridie discussed earlier, from manure handling areas, storing and moving manures on that farm, through infrastructure and also drainage as well. And then ensuring that we feed that back to the rest of our producers as well, so that any learnings can be shared. So, thinking more broadly, why does this matter to the laying industry? Well, as you will be aware, there's increased public awareness of poor nutrient management practices and its effects on the water environment. Really, we're in a keen position to ensure storage and use of manures is completed in accordance with regulations, so that's got to be key. The Land Code itself requires that all sites have a manure management plan in place. And we also want to ensure that where farmers are spreading to their own land, that they have nutrient management plans that are robust and have also been developed in accordance with a facts qualified advisor. We'd like to see some guidance for due diligence for farmers. So, for example, where the duty starts and stops when it comes to selling manures. So, for example, should the seller request a copy of the nutrient management plan from the buyer? And we see this as a sensible option to demonstrate due diligence going forward. So finally, where we see areas of opportunity, and some of these have already been touched on previously, is a common thread here. So ensuring that grant funding is available for poultry manure storage similar to slurry infrastructure grants that are offered to pigs, beef and dairy, so that there is parity between other livestock sectors. We'd welcome others to join the conversation so that we're well represented in this space also. We feel there's probably some improvement to be made in cross-sector communication on the issue of manure storage and use of manures across the country. So both involving livestock producers and arable farmers who will eventually use the manures that are produced. We would like RB 209 to be revised. I know there is consultation going on at this moment in time in terms of, or it's been in the past, but that change is happening. We would like updated poultry P manure values to be included in that. And one area where we could see a benefit going forward to reduce our reliance on imported fertilizers is research into funding to look at a full UK-wide manure movement management system to record inputs and outputs of manures across the country. And finally, increased investment opportunities in AD and pyrolysis, really in the areas where they're needed, so where manures are produced, but really to accelerate those through the planning issues that a lot of these sites have, and really just to transform some of the manures that we do have into usable forms that then could be more easily transported. So just to finish off, in summary, we should continue to work together as an industry, so we're well represented in all the discussions to influence decision makers. We need robust nutrient management plans, which will be key to ensuring that manures are used responsibly and prevent damage to the environment. And grant funding and external investment will be critical to ensure that we're well placed as an industry to manage manures in an environmentally sustainable way. Thank you. A bit of a whistle-stop tour, but there you go, Tom. Thank you.
Glenn, context of this evening, that's very welcome indeed. So no, whistle-stop, greatly appreciated. We're going to hand over now to Charles, Commercial Layer Manager at St David's. Charles is at pains to remind me to remind you that Charles is not a vet, but what Charles is a long-standing part of our industry, 15 years with Humphrey Feed and Pullets, and before that, very relevant direct experience of managing arable land, managing mixed farm enterprise, and that's what Charles is bringing to bear here. So Charles, over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. And yes, like Glenn, I will try and do a whistle-stop tour. So let's see whether the screen will change. That's a good point. Is it changing? It's not changing, is it? Can you see the screen, Tom?
I can see your screen, but just your headline slide at the moment.
Right. Okay.
There we go.
Right. Okay. So we'll skip straight to that. So effectively, I'm going to deal with some work that we were asked to do by BFREPA on manure moisture. I'm just going to run through the scope of the work we were asked to do, how we did it, the survey responses to the BFREPA Ranger survey, the results that we got back from people we did moisture surveys with, bit of a summary, Keith also asked me to do a little bit on nutrients. I think most of that's been covered, but I will just skid through it. And Q&As Tom's dealing with. So effectively, we were asked to look at a representative method for sampling belt cleaned aviaries. We weren't dealing with litter or anything like that. We were asked to find a testing system that would be could be replicated, accurate, to give us a moisture determination. Passively report on the base manure moisture levels from belt clean systems currently, and to look at interventions. And I use the word interventions advisedly because if anybody's looking for a magic silver bullet for making manure drier, there isn't one, but there are a number of things that can be done to achieve the required outcome. And then some conclusions, recommendations for BFREPA members were also asked for. So in terms of the site selection, we obviously need to deal with fresh manure, so it needed to be a belt clean system. In terms of the sampling, we need to be able to do multiple samples, replicate what's going on, because otherwise, if you're doing an intervention, how do you know how it's worked? We need to find an appropriate packaging and transporting method for poultry manure that was reliable and got it to us without upsetting the Royal Mail. We needed to find a testing system that was standardized and a sample preparation that allowed for a replicable testing system, and then we needed a fairly simple recording system that would allow recording over time. It wasn't ever going to be just one sample, it was going to be samples over a considerable length of time. So these are the survey responses from the Ranger survey that was done, instigated by Keith and the BFREPA Council. And so there were 69 respondents representing about 4 million hens, 4 million laying hens, sorry. The complete responses, I know there seems to be about 61, so that's people who actually filled in the response well and in a manner that we could actually understand. And basically there were 42 multi-tier units, 6 flat deck. They split sort of 50-50 on whether they were borehole or mains water. There were 4 on mixed water. The average flock size, as you would expect, was about 16,000. The sample results represent about 11 feed suppliers, and that includes home mill mix, and 11 vet practices. So the criteria for the initial moisture survey, this was to find out what the base level of poultry belt cleaned manure was in the layer industry, was obviously multi-tier aviary belt cleaned, testing fresh manure, not litter or manure stores. We weren't really interested in those because of storage. And we really needed to have 2 separate comparable houses or compartments because we were asked to look at interventions, which here, you need to have a treated area and then a control flock required for each site. So you really needed either 2 houses or 2 compartments that could be kept separate. We needed to be able to record the input and the output separately. Input was relatively easy because that's feed and water and bits and pieces. Output, slightly more complicated. Not everybody's got separate egg counters, but we haven't got that far yet. And we needed to be able to manage and understand the natural changes to the environment and the flock so that we could understand what was actually influencing, if anything was influencing, the manure moisture. So we selected for the base moisture test basically 42 producers. I just want at this point to talk about the core 4. These were 4 very kind producers, 2 of whom were on the BFREPA Council, so they had no choice, who volunteered to actually look at the testing and sampling system that we devised and see whether it was practical. They helped with the formulation of the survey so that it was applicable to farmers, and they also have done some initial testing on interventions to make sure that they only influence the manure moisture and don't influence the flock. So they've had a little try on that at the start. So that's the core 4. Very grateful to those, and I'm sure BFREPA generally and the members are as well. So the results. So we dispatched 43 sample kits, and the sample kits allowed you to sample 2 houses, 2 samples from each house. They had instructions on what to do so we could get a replicable sample. I won't go through it, but basically it involved getting fresh manure under 12 hours old off certain parts of the belt so you could go back over time and sample from the same place. Only those farmers who sent back samples will know how closely they followed that sampling technique, but that's not for me. We got 22 of the 43 samples left, so if anybody out there would like to explain what happened to the rest of them, I'd be more than interested. And only 15 of those had what I call a fully supporting survey. Having the manure is one thing, but understanding what's influencing it, in other words, the age of the birds, the laying percentage, perhaps how much water they're drinking, how much feed, and what sort of system they're in. Are they undertaking any treatments in terms of, maybe worming or red mite control or other things? So we only really got 15 what I call fully supported surveys in. We tested 147 samples, which covered 8 breeds. The ages were between 18 and 76 weeks. The laying rates were between 0, obviously, and 98%. And the egg size, which you're wondering what's the relevance of that, but we needed to know it, 52.6 to 65.51 grams. Now, there are some other categories here: mortality, feed consumption, water consumption, feed treatments, water treatments, and medication, which we received information for, but I'm not going to put that up on a screen like this. That is for BFREPA Council to decide what they want to do with it, but we did take that information and we have used it in analysis of the results. So, effectively, this graph shows the 2 lines at the top here, the green and the red, are basically what we call the A and the B samples. So I said that we sampled 2 houses and we sampled each house in 2 different places. So these represent the 2 different places in individual houses. The blue line represents the flock ages. So you've got here from about 24 weeks up to 78 weeks in age. And as you can see, the manure moistures sit in quite a neat band here. That's probably something like 64 to 76%. Pretty consistent. I'm happy that the testing method and the method of preparing the samples was accurate and repeatable. Generally speaking, it had a CV of under 2%, which means that the results were pretty accurate. So this is effectively a relationship. It's up and down, as you can see. There's no real relationship on here between age that you can see. You can probably tell that obviously as the birds come into lay, prior to them coming into lay, the manure moisture tends to be drier. I think you see that out on farm. If we actually look at the relationship between manure moisture and flock age, these are the sample points for all the ages that we took, and the 2 lines in the middle, what are called trend lines. So you could possibly say that the trend lines suggest that as flocks get older, maybe the manure gets a little bit drier. I would say that in the terms of this survey and the spread of the results, that is not statistically significant. It is significant that birds prior to coming to lay, in other words, pullets, do tend to have dry manure. So the interesting thing was that, as I said, the core 4 carried out some intervention trials. These were all feed interventions. In other words, there were additives or products put into the feed that were designed to do, well, effectively reduce the moisture in the manure. Some of them were specifically designed to that. In fact, 2 of them were, and 2 of them were designed for gut health more than anything else. You're going to say to me, hang on, Charles, you said there were 4. One of the farms, because it changed its flock during the course of this trial, obviously changed over from the end of flock, old birds, 78 weeks, 76 or 78 weeks, and put in a new flock of pullets. Obviously, I have no control there, and so consequently, I've excluded that product from the trial at the moment. So basically, we have product A, B, and C. Not going to tell you which they are. The expected sort of variation in results would be at about 5.8%, which is where this line here is. And so, although there'll be statisticians amongst you who will disagree, effectively, we only really need to look at results that are exceeding that sort of 5.8%. And we have one here which reduced the moisture between control and the treated by 10.6%. Now, this is one trial, one farm, one situation, but it is certainly worth potentially investigating that. And I understand that the council, BFREPA Council, are discussing where they want to go with the trials further on. So in summary, the system basically produced a repeatable testing method which we can use going forward. The CV was about 2.6. There is some refinement of the sampling required, in that I'm not sure that everybody followed exactly how we asked them to sample the moisture, in terms of we basically suggested that the belts were run and the house was emptied as normal, and then 12 hours later the belts were run 25% and a composite manure sample was taken, and then the belts were run 75% and a composite manure sample was taken. Not everybody has the facility to be able to run their belts the day after a contractor's been in to collect. We understand that, but it is important that because you're dealing with, probably, I don't know, 8 tons of manure in 3 days from some of these multi-tier houses, it's important with that amount of manure that you do get a homogeneous sample that is mixed up and is sampled at multiple points. The base moisture content that we reported back was between 65 and 78%, which was as expected. There was one outlier that was a bit lower, down at about 58%, but nobody reached the magic 50% we're looking for. It will require a combination of interventions to achieve 50%, but I think it probably is achievable. The targeted nutritional intervention, which we tested, did have a positive effect. But the most important thing is with, sort of basic nutrition for the flock, you need to match nutrition to output. You need to monitor changes in water quality, because particularly for borehole supplies, there is an effect of borehole water quality on the moisture of the manure. We did do water testing on site, and also I forgot to mention that when we were doing the moisture sampling, when they came in, we did do worm egg counts on those to have a look at that as well. And those people who had unexpected worm burdens, we obviously got in touch with them. And basically, the interventions that targeted good gut health are going to help you with the manure moisture, and also promoting a diverse microbiome in the bird, effectively keeping it healthy. So there's further work required on the interventions, because it's going to be a blend of mechanical interventions, nutritional interventions, and management interventions that are going to get you to that, shall we say, magically drier manure that doesn't suddenly sort of go into the store looking quite nicely heaped up, and then 2 days later it is like a pool on the floor. What you have to remember is that the manure dries quite quickly on the outside and remains sort of, excuse the phrase, gooey in the middle. And then, of course, as soon as it sits, it starts to, the moisture starts to move outwards and consequently reliquefy the manure. So we do need to get to a core drier manure. So just quickly on nutrients, I remember a long time ago, probably over 25 years ago, there was an article in Arable Farming, which was poultry waste or rocket fuel. It was really to do with spreading it evenly on arable ground in those days. So this issue has been around for a long time, but I really would say that we are dealing with a natural resource here in terms of manure, or a resource that needs to be valued properly. It is very valuable, and many of the presentations so far have touched on that. Phosphorus is vital for life. Nobody's really mentioned that, both for animals and plants. Bones, DNA, if you don't have a proper phosphate balance or phosphorus balance in your poultry diets, you will basically not get decent eggshells. And then for arable farmers, which I was once, vital for roots, and also DNA in both animals and plants. There are no commercial sources in the UK, so from a food security point of view, natural resources, we have to purchase phosphate and bring it in. So we need to look at this poultry manure resource as a valuable part of our food security. We rely on imports of about 140,000 tonnes. I think it's 147,000 tonnes, comes from all over the world. I've spread phosphate onto arable ground over 30 years from just about every corner of the world that produces it. Arable cropping generally in the country is phosphate depleting because effectively arable farmers potentially do not put enough. That's controversial, but I also agree with Glenn that RB209 needs to be quite seriously reviewed. I think there's a food security issue here because we do not have phosphate and we can't produce food without it, so we need to look after that. And I think it's important for UK food supply as well that we value this phosphate product and we find ways of transporting it from areas where it is in surplus to areas that are in deficit, and that sort of ties in with Glenn's national sort of manure redistribution. I think there is a need for some pump priming here. And that's effectively it.
Charles, fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to just dive straight over to Patrick, hoping Patrick is there.
I am, but I think
Patrick,
Kate needs to start my video if possible, please.
Just for everybody, Patrick is the managing director of Gamba Poultry Litter Limited. I was going to say Gamba Logistics, but Gamba Poultry Litter Limited. Yeah.
So if Kate's there, could she bring me online? Is Kate there, Tom?
Yes, just bear with me 1 second. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay, Patrick, there should be a bit. There we go.
Right, I'm there. And have you got my slides, please, Kate?
Yeah, just next. I'll do that next.
Well, I'll start talking whilst we're on because I know we're down to 144. So I'm Patrick Lewis, Managing Director of Gamba. Our business is buying and selling poultry litter. We do it throughout the country. We're challenged at the moment in the Wye Valley catchment area. Thank you very much. Go down to the next one, please, Kate. So we're working on helping to save the Wye. I won't dwell on any of this because, in fairness, Bridie did a very good job on this one. Next one, please, Kate. And I would say that Charles and Glenn have covered a lot of my ground, so that's going to help as well. That's the Wye Valley catchment area. Next one, please. So the short-term solution at the moment that we're doing, and this is with broiler litter, appreciating we're a layer litter, but I'll go through it very quickly for you, is that we are sending the litter at the moment out of the catchment area to places that actually have a use for it. So we are going to land, and as per the Lancashire University, there are areas, for instance, on the Cotswolds and in Staffordshire that are short of phosphates, so we're taking it there. We are taking it to a power station. It's a long way to go. This is a short-term solution, and we are taking it to AD plants. And as I say, this is broiler litter. Next one, please. So long-term solution, and in fairness to Glenn and Charles, that they touched on this. We are looking to be able to take it to places that need the litter. The slide here is showing the Wye Valley catchment area. If we can go on to the next one, please. So we're working with CXCS, which is a national company as well, and we're building a portal. Now, again, back to Charles and Glenn, this is something that will give total traceability to where the litter is coming from and going to. And obviously, where it is going to is the important part. So if it is going to land, we will require nutrient management plan and an agronomist's recommendation. And without that, we will not sell the people the litter. So next one, please. So you can see there, as far as the traceability of it goes, when the lorry is on site, it's got a weigher on it, and the haulier has an app. Within that app, registration number and the weight, and obviously being an app, it can show what time it was taken and where it was taken. So that information will be uploaded onto the portal. And then next site, please. Sorry, next slide. So the portal will give this total traceability. You can see five boxes down the bottom left-hand side there. And obviously, depending on where it goes, will depend on how many of the boxes need to be filled in. So if it's going to a power station, obviously that's different. Next slide, please. That is my final slide. So as Charles rightly pointed out, the difficulty with us with layer litter is having it dry enough, because the first thing is we actually can't get hauliers to come down the drive and pick it up. And the second one is the moisture in it. We are seeing products being used, whether it be within feed or whether it will be within the drinkers, which is actually making a pliable product. So those are trials that are taking place, and actually they are looking good. The good news, and I'll try and finish with some good news, is this: that having been to a recent conference where the government were showing currently there are 732 anaerobic digesters in the country, and by 2030 they require that number to be 2,000. I don't like the current finished product of digestate, and that's that's changing at the moment. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, by using layer litter, it's got the grit in it. So new technologies coming along with different grids which will allow for this. But the good thing is that there's so much government funding out there for green energy plants that businesses are taking it very seriously. So I believe within 18 to 24 months' time, there will be plants up and running throughout the country that will be able to take layer litter. And not only will they be able to take it, but they'll also pay a reasonable figure for it. A reasonable figure, I'm going to say, is between 10 and 20 pounds per tonne ex-farm. So hopefully that's good news. I know it's a very whistle-top tour, and hopefully that is some help to you all.
Patrick, thanks very much indeed. Can I just invite all of the speakers to put their cameras back on, and I'm going to try and whittle down the questions that we've had in advance and take some from the Q&A, live Q&A as well, and put them to the speakers. Patrick, brace yourself. You're last on. There's a question in the live chat that I think is pertinent to you, but please, anybody else, feel free to chip in. It relates to AD and the talk of the upcoming plants to which you've just referred. But the question from Nigel Hill, it says, how is AD a solution to land spreading manures? If nutrient in equals nutrient out, what solution is there for the solid digestate containing lots of the P? I wonder if you could talk to that, or anybody else on the panel, please.
Yeah, very, very quick answer to that is that depending on where the AD plant is being built, hopefully it is being built in an area that can take the NP and K and used in a sustainable manner, because your caller is exactly right. There's not the money in the product to be able to transport it around, and the other thing is it's not sustainable to do that. So the AD plants, wherever they're being built, hopefully they're being built in areas that need the phosphates.
So it's not about changing the composition of what goes in or what comes out. It's simply about moving it to where that digestate is actually going to be gainfully applied. And I think Charles pointed out this is a valuable resource, and a resource that we're a net importer for. It is simply about getting it to the right place. And several of you have said, a common message. Our challenge is dry matter, reducing moisture, increasing dry matter, thereby facilitating both storage and transport. It's then storage, and I'm going to refer to the BFREPA survey for free-range farms maybe 3 or 4 months or so ago that highlighted perhaps, or certainly in respondents, only 50% of people had storage, and over 90% were reliant on application to land within just a handful of miles from home. Albeit generally exported in inverted commas, i.e. being sold to a third party rather than being spread to their own land. So listening to Nick and to Sharon, storage, i.e. keeping it away from water, avoiding that waste classification is going to be absolutely critical. And I heard Bridie loud and clear say that muck storage was absolutely necessary. I'm gonna go to Nicola and Sharon, just building on that point about the absence of storage, and a question, please. I want to paint, if I may, the worst case scenario. We've got farms who, for a day, may have been heaping muck in the field, uncovered, unsheeted, and do not have muck stores presently. What response are they going to receive from an NRW or an EA inspector doing the usual rounds at the moment?
I'll go first, Sharon. So if they were picked up for a control of agricultural pollution regs inspection, they would be, first of all, we would inform Royal Inspectorate that they're not complying with the temporary storage heap requirements. And then for our date, and they would award breaches as per the penalty matrix, which is the verifiable standards are published, which I can send a link for you to. And with our day job, Pat, it would depend on a lot of things that we talked about with the targeting of the inspection in the first place. So it would depend on exactly where it is, the underlying groundwater, whether it's coming at us through the gate as we drive down the lane, whether that's going straight into a receiving watercourse, what the soil type's like, so we would take a whole host of things into consideration before we went down the enforcement route. And any enforcement that we would take, it has to go through various steps in internal governance. So you can't get one officer being very gung-ho and doing, threatening and serving notices and doing that type of thing, and another officer doing quite the opposite. Everything goes through and is signed off by internal governance. So we have that structure in place. Does that answer your question? It's a bit horses for courses. It
does, and I also want to acknowledge that something that you I can't remember, Sharon or Nick, which one of you presented the slide, but you talked about not just being about enforcement. It's about consultation, it's about advice, it's about support, it's about working with farmers, etc., etc., etc. I think the fundamentals at grassroots level are that the infrastructure, I interpret the data at least to say that it is lacking, and therefore it will be a surprise to me at least if there wasn't a case for some urgent redress. And so you've painted very clearly the NRW position. Sharon, I wonder if you would do the same for the EA, please.
Yeah, and our approach mirrors exactly what Nick said with regards to the Environment Agency approach and our approach to enforcement. So that is exactly the same. And the other thing that I'd just like to add is, obviously we were trying to stress as well the value of manure in its monetary terms as well. And that's why in that advice and guidance we give, that we try to have that conversation as well with farmers to think about, any runoff from that manure is runoff of nutrients and valuable resource. And when we look at the equivalent of fertilizer price, and we don't know, with fluctuations in fertilizer prices and volatility in the market, that that manure can become even more valuable at different times. And so it's really, really critical as a resource that it's utilised. And I know also, I think Charles picked up on the point that, and Glenn, that phosphate is it's a finite resource, and the mineable sources of it are declining. So we need to make the most of all these, these sustainable kind of renewable sources. So again, that's another important value, not just in terms of the regulations and protecting the water environment, but it's keeping that in mind as well, that those losses are going to cause damage for which we will regulate. But there's a double whammy because you're also losing resource. So I think that's really important to keep in people's mind as well.
Thank you. Next question, I would say probably most geared toward Bridie, but possibly Glenn as well. And that's, you're spending time out in the field. Put storage to one side. If we've got farms that have got manure storage, whether the dry matter is where they would like it to be, or 30% in line with Charles's stats, if it can be stored, then box ticked and largely under control, room for improvement, but largely under control. Without a manure storage, a building, what have you guys seen that might constitute best practice at mitigating the potential risk, or what advice would you be giving farms that haven't got a manure store today so that they can keep the right side of the regulations?
Shall I take that?
Great, Bridie, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair. So I have been to a farm, and I didn't see the heap, but it was a farm with a flat deck site, and the farmer told me that they cover up their manure heap, so they take the muck out when they do the flock turnaround. They take it out to a field headland, stick it in a field heap, and cover it with a silage sheet and tuck it in under the edges of the silage of the heap. And they say that works very well. I mean, that's possibly practical just about with a flat deck shed, but when it comes to a multi-tier shed, I just can't see that it's ever practical to go for that. Covered field heaps. I haven't come across any examples of anybody doing that successfully, but I have been to a farm where they'd, as a sort of temporary measure, put up a polytunnel and constructed this polytunnel over where they were storing their manure on a field headland, and that was doing a really good job of containing it all and just stopping any rain falling on it. So another thing, just bring up another thing, because I think Nicola was talking about issues around the elevators and the muck trailers, and in an ideal world, those that pad where the trailer and the elevator sit would be concreted so that you could keep it clean, would be roofed in an ideal world, but a lot of it is down to attention to detail and management. And I've been to one site where, because there's often spillage of muck that falls off the bottom of an elevator, and one farmer had gone to the trouble of taking his elevator apart and putting rubber seals down the sides to stop that muck falling off onto the floor. And he'd also modified his trailer so that it was really easy it was just the right height for the chute. And the other thing to do is to make sure that all the elevators have wind chutes on the end, so that there's no kind of blow of the dry muck off the end of the elevator before it drops into the trailer. So there's lots of small things that farmers can do, and often it's about the management and the attention to detail, but a bit of financial investment in the area also is invaluable.
Glenn, I don't know if there's anything you want to follow on.
All I was going to say, Tom, I think a flat deck system, it lends its hand to being usable in a lot more ways. So for example, you're clearing that manure up in one go for people like Patrick and Gambers. That is easy then to deal with because it's stored within the building. Where it gets tricky is with multi-tier systems, where you are regularly cleaning out the shed. And if you don't have a manure store, that's when it can become problematic. But the best answer that you can deal with that manure, if you are storing it in field heaps, is to cover that manure.
Glenn, they're going to come back straight back to you. But again, anybody else that wishes to jump in, please do. What role do you think the supply chain have got in supporting farms making these adjustments? Whether it's sharing best practice, whether it's accessing independent, government funding if it's available, or helping with the financing of this. How do you see businesses like packers, retailers, even feed manufacturers, etc.? How do you see them playing their part?
Yeah, so I think our approach has definitely been support for our producers. So where we can, knowledge sharing, working with organisations like the Wireless Foundation. Or the consultation that we have with the regulators as well, sharing that best practice. We feel probably there's more people to be involved with that discussion. and we would definitely welcome any other members to get involved with that discussion. We then do have a louder voice that we can lobby the likes of DEFRA to really put our point of view across as to what the real crux of the problem is. And it generally goes back to, if you do have better manure storage, the options then for dealing with that manure, whether it be through AD, spreading on land, through pyrolysis, and all the other technologies that are
going to throw composting in there. I'm a massive fan of composting. I think there's definitely something in combining other biomass, creating a more stable, a drier material that's capable of being stored and then moved away.
Yeah, that's right. But without good manure storage, you can't achieve that, you see. So it is a means to an end, but you need to get that right first, I think.
Yeah. I'm going to draw it to a close. We're going to be kicked off by the wonder that is Zoom in 2 minutes' time, and so I'm going to wrap up. To the audience, for your patience, thank you. We're grossly over time. You can hold me uniquely responsible for that. Sorry. To our speakers, thank you for giving up much more of your evening than you ever planned. And I know it wasn't just the time that you spent on the call. It's in the preparation in advance. And lastly, Keith. And Kate, thank you once again for organising it. A reminder: this has been recorded. We will publish the recording in the days ahead. And if we haven't answered your question, please accept my apologies. But you will receive an answer to those as soon as we've got it done. So again, thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Bye.
Thanks, Tom. Well done.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for taking.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you all.